I'm going to mute myself until.
Yeah, it's bringing participants in now. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, I'm just waiting till the participant number stabilizes before we kick in. Ewald, you should probably put yours on mute.
Okay.
While you're waiting, I see everybody else is. Just in case there's any background from your end. Oh, we're getting some good participation. Okay, it looks like it's slowing down, stabilizing. Okay, getting a nice crowd. You may notice also that participants are using the chat feature, which is terrific, introducing themselves to other participants. So if you are a participant, waiting just another minute to make sure we've got everybody on, please feel free to use the chat. And well, we've got from India to Greece to Cabo and Berlin. That's exciting. Halifax. Wow, it's really jumping now. Okay. Grace, should I begin? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, very good. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Responsible Travel, and I'm also one of the founders of the new Future of Tourism Coalition, of which I'm happy to report there are several of our coalition colleagues on the webinar today. And on behalf of CREST and our distinguished panel of thought leaders, I want to welcome you. It's exciting that we have participants today from across the globe and a wonderful panel of thought leaders for this 2020 World Tourism Day webinar. Earlier this month, and in collaboration with more than 30 leading tourism organizations, researchers, and institutions, many of which are actually on this webinar today, CREST launched our new report, The Case for Responsible Travel, Trends and Statistics 2020. We'll be posting in the chat, if it's not already there momentarily, a URL link if you want to then access that report. This year's report shares key studies on COVID-19 and climate change and what lessons may be applied from the pandemic to meet the challenges of the climate crisis. In addition to general consumer, business, and destination trends in the context of recovery, we explore the unprecedented challenge and opportunity to mitigate two existential threats, COVID-19 and the climate crisis. With a more coordinated approach, we can truly make the world a safer, more equitable, and more resilient place for all. No question, the pandemic has impacted every facet of life and fundamentally changed the way destinations, businesses, and travelers will plan, manage, and experience tourism moving forward. That said, for decades, tourism has frankly been on a path of self-destruction, valuing profits at the expense of people, planet, and purpose. At the same time, the climate crisis remains an existential threat that has real consequences for destinations and communities everywhere. COVID-19 has shown that simply stopping tourism is not enough to meet the challenges of the climate crisis, and has also highlighted the immense need and value of tourism. Clearly, crisis often breeds innovation, and destinations, communities, and businesses must not let this opportunity go to waste. The tourism industry has been forced to adapt to the pandemic, and the same rigor and dedication must be applied to neutralize the threat of climate change as we look to the future of tourism. At CREST, we believe that post-COVID, there will be a profound shift in the competitive landscape in the travel and tourism sector. With preparation and effective risk management, adaptation and resilience, and decarbonization being fundamental to future competitiveness and relevance. And it's my great pleasure to turn today's webinar over to our good friend, CREST board member and founder and managing director of JustaTAAD in the Caribbean, Denaye Hinds, who will shepherd this wonderful group of thought leaders through some, I think, interesting and thought-provoking questions. So Denaye, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Greg. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. On the heels of our World Tourism Day, CREST and all of our panelists are excited to chat with you, or to chat amongst ourselves today and hear from you and answer some of your questions that you have. Now, before we go ahead and get started, I would like to get a few housekeeping rules out of the way. For all of our amazing participants from around the world who are tuning in today, we know you guys are going to have burning questions for our panelists once we conclude our discussion. So I ask that you utilize the question and answer right down the bottom of your screen. It should be a Q&A with two little bubbles. You can put in all of your questions that you have into that chat, please, and then we'll be sure to get to them as much as we can once we have concluded the initial discussion that I'm going to have with these three lovely folks who I will introduce you to in a minute. And also, if you have resources or different ideas or comments as we're going through, there's the chat function for that, which I see you guys are already using. So kudos and snaps to you for being tech savvy and introducing yourselves so we can all get acquainted. So we have this amazing panelist of three wonderful people who I'm excited to chat with today to talk about COVID-19 and tourism and what we're seeing and what we hope to see in the future, as well as the story around climate change. So first and foremost, I'll introduce Dr. Daniel Scott. Hi, Daniel, give a wave so we know who we're talking to. This gentleman is the Executive Director of the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change at the University of Waterloo. He's worked extensively in the area of climate change throughout the global tourism sector and focused on adaptation and complex impacts of the carbon tourism economy. He actually has been a contributing author and an expert reviewer of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for their 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th assessment report. So we have a lot of knowledge with Dr. Scott. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. Next up in the line is the fabulous Miss Erin Francis-Cummings. She is the president and CEO of Destination Analysts. Hey there, Erin, thanks for joining us. We're excited you could take the time to share your expertise. She is the go-to resource in the destination marketing industry. And she spent the last 2 decades studying travelers from across the globe. So she knows her stuff. And she's led great destination brands such as my home country, Bermuda. Shout out to the Bermuda Islands, the Fiji Islands, California, and Florida. So she has extensive experience in destination analysts. And she currently serves on the international board for the Travel and Tourism Research Association. And then last but not least, a dear friend of mine, I'm happy to report and happy to introduce him, Mr. Ewald Biemans. He is a highly motivated sole owner of this amazing resort, Bucuti and Tara Beach Resort in Aruba. And you see the lovely background there where he is. Extremely involved in the hospitality industry, a champion for environmental and sustainability good, climate change extraordinaire. And he's been a long-serving board member of both the Aruba Hotel and Tourism Association, working with governments to introduce innovative green technologies throughout the country. So he is a friend and also a pioneer in the area of sustainability, climate change, adaptation in the hospitality industry. So we have three amazing panelists who we are sure will give us amazing insight into some of these questions. So I'm just going to kick it off and start with the first question that I'm going to ask initially to Scott, because we want to understand, what are tourism destinations doing to pivot now in this response to the profound impacts of COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis.
Thanks, Denaye. Yeah, so while we're watching both of these or two different global crises unfold on certainly different timescales, what I see generally is the responses still remain separate. So with respect to the COVID, I think you're seeing a full range or a spectrum of responses amongst destinations, and the place of sustainability within that really varies. Sort of at one end, and you see this a little bit in the media with different pundits, you've still got the let the good times roll as soon as possible school of thought, if you will. And then others are taking that longer view, really, re-envisioning tourism as a sustainable social force and what can be done to position it as we come out of COVID. So at that one end of the spectrum, and fully understand businesses that, are looking at Q2 or Q4 now, focused on survival. Some of those are exploring new markets. So you mentioned the Caribbean as one example. Barbados and some others have been starting to look at digital nomads. So lengthening out that length of stay, upgrading the internet, so that rather than working out of your condo tower in New York, you're working for 6 months, 4 months at a 5-star resort somewhere in Barbados or other places. At the other end of the spectrum, and that's the one that I really want to highlight, it gets to some of Gregory's points. We've seen some examples in the media, Barbados beyond tourism, to stay in a Barbados context. But the one that I do want to highlight in terms of concrete actions is New Zealand set up a tourism futures task force. I think it was established in sort of mid-June this year. And it's public, private partnership to really critically look at the future of tourism in New Zealand. And their mandate specifically states, and I want to get this right, the task force must seek to create a shift in the tourism system. So that's some really critical rethinking that's going on in that part of the world. And I'd like to see more of that going on. But again, it takes, leadership. So we'll hear from some of the others if they see that amongst, their colleagues that they work with.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. And Ewald, from a business perspective, we understand that, sustainability, climate change, and COVID-19 are all three things that we're grappling with. How are you seeing it from the hospitality sector, from your business standpoint? How is sustainability fitting into these pivots that we're seeing based on the COVID-19 pandemic? Unmute yourself.
I'm convinced that this is a new era for the hospitality industry. It fits right into sustainability. People are much more health conscious today. They are outdoors, they're exercising, they're eating healthily, and there's so much more demand for health and wellness. People are resting and working on their fitness. There is, the spa business is booming. The cruise industry, one of the largest polluters in the world, has come to a standstill, which is a great thing. Air traffic has decreased by 60–70%, and car traffic probably the same in your areas around the world. The cars that are electric cars are having a great run for business. The tourism industry is cleaning up its act, I think. And over-tourism has come to a screeching halt. All these points will help sustainability tremendously. in many ways. Of course, we still have to deal with global warming and climate change, and especially the Caribbean, which is so vulnerable. But that is a worldwide effort that will have to be undertaken. But in the hospitality industry, we see a trend towards less and better. So I see that we are making real progress towards a more sustainable life, a more sustainable industry.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. And the points that you mentioned just about, you know, looking at it from and understanding that climate change is still a part of, you know, the equation, as well as sustainability. And you said earlier that sustainability and your response to COVID has kind of been the same. There really hasn't been a dramatic pivot in that sense, because sustainability has really underpinned a lot of the health and safety concerns that you would have had to, you know, beef up for COVID-19 protocols and everything within the tourism business and within your hotels. I want to ask Erin this question because, you know, we're seeing this play out from a destination standpoint and from a business standpoint, but from a consumer standpoint, what are consumers saying? How are they looking at, say, loyalty and trust to a place when they're looking to travel in this, you know, COVID-19 pandemic? What are some of the trends that you're seeing and some of the things that are top of mind for you from a consumer standpoint?
Well, I actually, just to familiarize the audience with our work at Destination Analysts, since March 15th, we've conducted a weekly survey of 1,200 American travelers. So we have about 7 months of data and a lot of trends. And so in anticipation of this conversation today, I actually asked some questions this past weekend about how Americans, at least, are thinking about sustainability and their consciousness of climate change. And there has been, since last fall, the last time I asked this set of questions in another survey that we did, there's been a 10% increase in people saying that they see that leisure travel has an impact on the environment. It's still relatively low overall, it's still under 30%, but still to see a 10% gain just in 1 year, I think for those of you online, and that's a good trend. We're moving in the right direction. And I think that we'll see in a lot of the data that people are just, they have there's a converging path. They're just more, they have a more consciousness of how they're going to behave because COVID brought that in. When I've interviewed business travelers lately, you know, the perception of tourism's excess, I think that's going to go away, at least in the short term, because of COVID. Like business travelers say, like, I'm going to be more conscious about the trips I take. I'm not going to do all these dinners and all these things. It's just a different mindset that we're seeing. And in the survey too, we see people saying like, I'm going to avoid crowded places. I am going to be more aware of the trash that I create or the health and sanitation. And then I think, though, Denaye, to your first question, we do a lot of business research of tourism leaders, and we could see when we surveyed destination marketing organization leaders last year that they really saw that sustainability and climate change was something that they needed to start tackling now. A majority of them said that was going to be a big part of their jobs in the next year. And I think what COVID did was really show that tourism is a leader it can be a leader in the overall health and humanness of a destination. And you see all these DMOs taking part, doing the advertising and the public health campaigns about how to travel safely. And I think that sets a precedent for how people should behave correctly when they travel and not have such an impact on the environment. I think again, that COVID's setting a great precedent that tourism has a place in that.
I agree, and that mirrors a lot of what Ewald mentioned in terms of people being more conscious, more health conscious. They're focused on that a lot more. And then also Scott mentioned New Zealand having this new platform, which brings me to the next question, actually, which is, you know, given this double threat of COVID and the climate crisis, can destinations truly make changes now to meet the needs of this whole quality over quantity, you know, because, you know, Erin, you mentioned the whole, you know, business travelers are being more thoughtful. They're not going to do as many activities. They're probably going to be a little bit more private. People are kind of doing things kind of on their own. So Daniel, for this, you know, for the destination themselves, do you think that they'll be able to make this change of quality over quantity? We heard that mass tourism has kind of died down and going away in terms of their approach to tourism. If so, how, and if not, why?
That's a great question. It's what all the destinations are facing, and my gut response is, of course they can. Many destinations, as the other panelists have already talked about, this has been you know, something they've been considering for some time. In some cases, you know, a decade. Over tourism in Barcelona, over reliance on the tourism economy in some cities. At the same point, you know, we can't simplify or overly simplify how challenging that transition can be. If it was easy to do, everyone would have done it 10 years ago, right? You know, and so it's something we have to work towards. Most destinations want that high yield, responsible tourists, but transitioning from mass tourism, you know, it takes time. It takes, you know, an inclusive, unified vision. Even in a case like Barcelona, we saw that the community wanted one thing, and many of the tourism industry players did as well, but the local municipality owns the airport and wouldn't reduce slots, so you still had too many people coming in for the preferences of some. So destinations have to get on the same page with that and a unified vision, and that takes time. And I would emphasize, you know, it takes leadership, and it would be interesting to see what Erin and Ewald say. But whether it's climate change, and to some extent even in the COVID context, when I look at leadership, it's really coming from the business or the destination community, the bottom up. It's not coming as much as I'd really like it to see from some of the pan-global or the international organizations. And in some cases, you know, there's climate change or COVID sort of compressed the timeline on our climate change response. I hear some pundits talk about it in the media as if this is the sort of, you know, permanent state. You know, 3 years from now, this too shall pass. And we'll be left with 5 years less to address, as Ewald said. You know, the climate change is coming. It's still a big issue down the path for many destinations. And as a sector, we're really unprepared still for either a +2 world, which has the major low carbon transition coming right away, or you know, a +3 or higher world where substantial impacts come from many parts of the world. And we're seeing sort of the early parts of that wave, whether it's the California fires, what's happened in the Great Barrier Reef, and some of the, you know, superstorms that are going through the Caribbean.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel, for that. Because it's interesting, you know, because sometimes some destinations are seeing, well, okay, do I face COVID now or do I face climate change now? But, you know, like you said, they're kind of somewhat intertwined, and now they're kind of having this ability to pause and say, well, you know, we can't really do one without the other, you know, when it comes to funding. And you mentioned leadership as being a really key component to this, and having people step up. From that perspective, in terms of, I want to go back I want to go now to the business standpoint. Ewald, quality over quantity. I know you run a boutique resort, and you've managed a lot of other resorts and just hospitality businesses and tourism businesses. How does that resonate with you? That quality over quantity from a business standpoint?
I've been always the hotelier that said quality is more important than the quantity. I limited my amount of rooms substantially because I didn't want to lose the personal touches and the quality that a smaller resort can deliver. And through the years of my sustainability time or effort, I've noticed that people have no problem paying more for a sustainable, well-run and well-managed resort. So quality is today even more so in demand, and as long as the aspect of luxury is not infringed upon. And we say that luxury and sustainability are definitely not mutually exclusive. So it is really not a problem. And in fact, in Aruba, the hotels, the 4- and 5-star hotels have not lowered their rates. Everybody's charging the same rates that they were charging before the event of the virus. The customer also knows that we have invested lots of monies in safety, security, and their well-being. We have had to buy equipment, and we had to install and train people in a total new mode. And so, for instance, in our case, we installed UVC lights in every room, ionizers in every room, so that there is absolute no chance that the customer can get infected. The rooms are sealed. So customers are aware that all these efforts bring costs with them. We also had to reduce the amount of seating in the restaurant. We had to we don't check in too many people at the same time, so there's extra staff available. So really, I think quality will prevail. The other thing is, of course, that the customer that travels today is probably not the masses. It's probably more the people that can afford to travel safely and pick the right resorts, or the right airline, or the configuration that makes them feel comfortable.
Do you feel that, when we're talking about quality and we're talking about, mass tourism kind of coming down, and, select group of travelers will be traveling now for those who can afford to, do you see this trend going beyond just, the next 2 to 3 years, where it's seeming like travel will only be for those who can afford it? Do you think that maybe economically speaking, that the whole idea of people traveling during COVID will only be for a certain class of people? Or do you think it'll just kind of take its course?
I strongly believe that the business is not going to come back that quickly. And for the tourist, or for the traveler to travel, he will probably, the airlines, for instance, will have to charge more because they cannot carry 100% passengers. The hotels will have additional costs that will have to be spread out over a 50, 60% occupancy or 40% occupancy. I don't think in the next at least 2 years, there will be much change. And so travel will be probably much more limited to an upper scale customer that is able to afford and can afford to stay in a bit of an upscale environment. He will look for security. They will look for safety. They will look for nature. They will look for pristineness, because people will stay away from over-tourism. And we have seen some changes in Aruba dramatically also, that the destruction of the environment has come to a standstill. The fact that the cruise ships are no longer roaming the world with their spewing chimneys, we see an absolute change, and for the better.
Yeah. And this leads me to ask Erin to jump in on this a bit, because I want to understand, while we're on the topic of travel and quality over quantity and, climate crisis versus COVID, how are consumers responding to this? And people who are traveling right now, Do they have COVID in their mind, safety and health in their mind, the climate crisis in their mind? Is this top of mind for those consumers? Outside of COVID, is climate change a concern for them? And, are you seeing a different type of travel when we look at tourism? Look at tourism right now, and your thoughts on how it's going to be in the next 2 to 3 years.
I will say, unfortunately, what I've seen, at least amongst American travelers, is who's traveling right now are those that feel less risk averse. It's not just luxury. That's really the driver. If they feel less risk, that it's less of a risk and they're not as worried about COVID, that's who's traveling right now. But I really like this quality over quantity discussion, because the largest group of travelers, if they're not already, they soon will be, are millennial and Gen Z. And when we look at how they respond to questions about, do humans have an impact on the climate, and do you think about your impact on the environment when you make decisions around travel? For some of those questions, they're more than twice as likely as older generations to agree with it, which, so again, these are good trends. But as we know, millennials, like, they travel is so, I mean, that's why travel's been doing so well for the past decade, is so much part, I think, that of that generation's identity was travel. And so I wonder now if COVID is, it's a good question to ask, will they now make quality decisions instead of, I took, 30 trips last year, or I had 200,000 miles in the air. And, Daniel brought up people are extending their stay. Maybe it'll lead to this quality over trips rather than quantity. And another thing happening right now that may contribute to that is the travel shaming that's going on. I just asked this last weekend about what was deterring people from traveling more. COVID is number one, but I think really related to that, and it wasn't as significant a percentage, but it's still notable, was that the social aspect, the fear of being judged for traveling. And again, I think, as we keep talking about why this conversation is so important, like what we're learning from COVID and convergence and these things all contributing to a better, more sustainable travel future. It's like, that's okay. Now we're dealing with a mindset of like, think before I travel. Should I be making these decisions, and I should make right ones so that I don't get judged. I mean, we can use this sort of shaming in it to put travel in a good direction.
I agree. It's definitely, I'm personally not a shamer, but I see that it's happening, and people are being more conscious, like you mentioned, about the decisions that they're making. And I think that's also resonating with the destinations as well. Daniel, you had a point to make.
I know you'll probably move us on to something other, but I wanted to build on the point that both Erin and
discussion around it. So go ahead.
Erin and Ewald mentioned on over tourism, perhaps shifting from, so Aruba is benefiting from some of that. But in some parts of the world that have really strong domestic markets that, as Erin said, haven't been able to travel, at least overseas, because of travel restrictions, that over tourism has shifted to domestic destinations in ways that we wouldn't have anticipated, whether it's the coastal places in the British Islands, inland lakes, mountain communities in the United States and Canada and other places. And so to Erin's point about learning from COVID, not just from a consumer's perspective, but from the destinations, in some respects, if we look at what a low carbon tourism future for, say, Europe might look like, part of that is staying closer to home, staying longer. And this sort of experiment we've been thrust into provides us some good opportunities to learn from that, of how did some of those communities didn't anticipate that additional demand. And what do they need to do differently to make sure they don't have the same problems with over-tourism as some other places have had over the last several decades? So there's a lot that CREST and others can do in terms from a research perspective that can help us learn over the next couple of years and apply that, for climate change in the decades ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you, Daniel, for adding those notes. And just, to comment on that, we're seeing what I find interesting, and what I'm seeing in some of the work and the research that I've been doing, is looking at how a lot of these destinations are pivoting to look at, like you mentioned, having more staycation type of atmosphere, where we're seeing higher increase in domestic travel, maybe not as much as international, because that may be out of reach. And as Erin mentioned, the fear of traveling is COVID, and those who can afford to travel with increased protection and security and safety measures will be traveling. And to some extent, it kind of like the international travel, it seems as though it might be becoming a little bit elitist and maybe not as equitable as it was, and it might happen for a time being throughout COVID. And that's something that we can look to address and obviously look at as things roll out. But also this idea of staying in place and getting to know home and staycations and domestic travel is still unique and exciting in the same point, because it's starting to slowly open back up tourism, and people are starting to see and hopefully support more small businesses, because we want to have more equitable distribution in tourism, not only from a destination perspective, from the small business perspective as well. So this could be a really positive change, not only for the environment, but also for encouraging that more domestic travel, that more domestic tourism, and encouraging that small business or those smaller businesses, and seeing that equitable distribution of the funds of that, tracking that tourism dollar back into the community, so that we can see more funding for these climate solutions, so that we can not only address COVID, but address safety, security, address sustainability, address a more sustainable way of travel, and have these solutions in tow for that. So this brings me to my next question, which is, in the wake of the economic havoc of COVID-19, because that's what we've been talking about just now, and this equitable distribution, understanding that destinations and businesses have to do everything they can to stay afloat. So people are changing protocols, people are implementing new protocols, maybe staff are less or on shifts, and different things are changing. How do we feel that sustainability and looking at climate solutions is able to play a role in this effort, recognizing that we do have that extreme economic concern? I touched on it a little bit, but Daniel, I'd like for you to elaborate from a destination standpoint a little bit more about recognizing this effort to stay afloat, but also having the need to generate income to ensure that sustainability is still had, because it is still expensive to implement some of these measures and relatively inexpensive to implement others. But from a destination standpoint, how are we recognizing sustainability to play that role, despite, a lot of these economic concerns that destinations may be having?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a real challenge, but there's a real opportunity here as well. And I think when we look at a destination scale, whether it's a small island or a state level, country level, there's a lot of money. There's a once in a generational investment coming. It's in the process, and the COVID economic stimulus is a key part to sustainability in tourism, sustainability writ large. And if it's done right, it could be a real boost to the low carbon transition, to a just transition on the climate front. But if countries don't prioritize, if that policy of climate and other sustainability elements is not built into that stimulus, I think it will actually work against some of the sustainability momentum that we had. And a paper that we published, I think in April, I think it was, we looked at what was the place of climate and sustainability within the planned economic recovery plans at the time. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of green, shall we call it, outside of Europe. And since then, there's an organization called Vivid, who's done an analysis of stimulus index, and they've sort of unfortunately confirmed what we saw early on to this point. European Union and some of the countries within it, Canada to some extent, they're rating as green, but a lot of the countries with the biggest economies, the United States, Russia, Brazil, China, India, were in the bottom 5. And so that sort of, improper or unsustainable investment might actually work against us in the longer term, unfortunately. So, and that has that trickle down effect, because as much as, we want consumers, and Erin will speak to this more, to act in a sustainable way, you know, as a climate scientist, I don't put climate solutions on consumers' shoulders. And part of that is even within the bubbles that I live in, which are usually very progressive people, they're climate environment conscious. I don't see enough of the action or voting as if our house was on fire, to put, you know, Greta's words to use. So I don't put it on the consumers. I think there has to be that transformative change at the system level. So if you make the grid carbon neutral, it doesn't matter what your crazy Uncle Donald does with their air conditioning, right? You know, so it has to be solved at that level. And that's where this green, you know, investment as part of a COVID recovery could be a huge part of that if it's done well.
I agree. Erin, I'd love for you to chime in on that. You know, is it the consumer's responsibility? Are consumers even aware of it? You know, is that a decision that they're thinking about when they're making traveling decisions? And then I want to flip over to Ewald to get some insights on something else.
I couldn't agree more, and Daniel just said it beautifully. It's when I look on the consumer side, it has to be done on the governmental level, because it just can't be put on them. I mean, I see a lot of people want to do the right thing, but they need to be, unfortunately, they need to be directed. I mean, you've seen in America this summer, people wanted to be in the outdoors and connect with nature, which is great. Then they're leaving all this trash everywhere and just like trashing these beautiful spaces until someone had to tell them, like, no, this is how we don't tolerate this. Like, this is how it has to be done on that level. And I was just, before jumping on here, I was just looking at a question I asked about what environmental things do you actually think about when traveling? And none of the ones I tested, and I tested all the major ones, not even half of American travelers said that. But the most common one was plastic. So, you know, whatever we've done in the media or that plastic, they seem to be getting that, but they're not getting carbon as much. And so just to make Daniel's point even further, it's just too much to put it onto them alone. Needs like large leadership, governmental change.
I agree. So that means that we need to do more, also not only from a governmental standpoint, but from a destination and probably a business standpoint, to explain to our consumers exactly what it is that we're doing, and be an example, lead by example, which is great into my next question to Ewald, which is, you know, the topic of carbon and carbon neutral. Bucuti and Tara has done this already with your resort. How are you educating consumers and allowing them to understand just the impact that they have by staying at your resort? And, you know, give us that insight on that journey into carbon neutral and the consumer response to that. I think that's an interesting story that we want to hear a little bit about, because that speaks to the climate change scenario that we're always trying to look at today.
And for us, it has been a tremendous gain. The fact that we certified LEED and later on carbon neutral, actually, we were able to tell our customers, when you stay with us, the only thing you leave behind is your footprint in the sand. You are actually emitting less carbons than if you would stay at home. We have proven that through a study. We took emissions from the airlines and from an average household and the car traveled to a destination somewhere in Florida or something like that, and compared these numbers. And in fact, a customer that stays with us comes from, say, for instance, from the East Coast of the United States, stays with us in a room, not a suite, but in a large, comfortable room, spends a week with us, eats in our restaurant, which is, first of all, attuned to sustainability, and goes home, has actually had less emissions than if you would have stayed at home or taken a car and drove to Disney World in Florida or something like that. So, and the customer accepts this so readily, and he's so happy. He feels actually redeeming himself by staying in a environmentally sustainable resort, or in a location that is that has sustainability at heart. And so it behooves anybody to start thinking in that direction, because the whole world eventually will have to go that way. And here's an offer from my part. As a resort, we are certified 4 ways, and we are carbon neutral certified. And if anybody's interested in our journey and how we got there and what it takes, we're willing to help anybody. The more that get on the bandwagon here, the better for all of us, because we really need to work on climate change and global warming. Aruba, for instance, is in a situation that my resort is 1.5 meters above sea level. If global warming continues on its course, pretty soon, the same beach you see behind me will be covered with water, and we're going to have to go snorkel to see that beach. So it is in my own interest and in the interest of half of the world, actually, to do our best to preserve and to do as much as we can to ameliorate the damage that we're doing. And so that's my offer.
I think that's great. Thank you so much, Ewald. And that puts into perspective a lot of what Daniel and Erin were saying in terms of, the governments and the businesses need to do the work. The consumers aren't always going to understand or know. And your resort is a testament to how we can educate people. It's edutainment, I like to call it, where they're there for leisure, or maybe they're for business, and they get to understand something that they didn't even, think was at top of mind, and they're doing it with ease. And so when they can go on vacation and see that businesses are making that step to curb their emissions and to reduce their waste, and they're seeing it in such a beautiful atmosphere and environment, and they're appreciative of it, because I know you have a lot of repeat guests. That says something to them in their minds that they can then take that back home, and that bridges that gap from the consumer not knowing, who may have just visited Bucuti or Aruba for the first instance, and them now having a better understanding of how how a business can do it, and then how they can maybe translate that into real solutions, tangible solutions that they can understand, because they're actually experiencing it at your resort. So that's good. You had another point to make.
Yeah, well, there's also a lot of education involved. We have an extensive educational program for staff and for our customers. When our customer arrives, the first thing he sees on their television in the room is a welcome message and an environmental video. We explain our process from A to Z. We educate our staff. They're out with us cleaning up, and they're out with us and carrying the message home to their children and so forth. But we additionally, we do that. If we have a site inspection by a group of operators or a group of travel agents, we bring them into into one of our little meeting rooms, and we give them an environmental tour. We show them all we do. Mm-hmm. And we prove to them that actually it does not hurt, or that luxury is not influenced by an environmental conservation program. In fact, they go hand in hand. And so a lot of it will be education of the customer as well. And the more they understand how it all works and how well it does for the environment, the more they understand that they should go to a place that is environmentally friendly, that considers nature and reduces the amount of emissions, whatever the case may be. For instance, we have an entire program. For instance, we serve food. We save. We call it healthy portions. In our restaurant, we noticed that 30% of our food was going back to the kitchen. We reduced our portions about 30%. We reduced our price accordingly, and we tell people that we don't want to have that waste. In fact, people love it They buy more because now they have room for an appetizer or dessert. 30% of our waste is no longer there. And the little waste that is still created goes to the big farmer that then feeds it to
So you have a closed loop system.
Yes.
Where
So, we reduced our garbage delivery to the landfill by 65%.
Excellent.
The customer helps us do this.
Mm-hmm.
So if you bring the customer on board and you try to get them to embrace the program, you gain a customer for life.
Yeah, it's the why behind and telling them the story of what happens that gets them engaged and allows them to act. I would love to take this conversation, and I know we have some questions. I do want to ask a lot of other questions myself, but I do want to give the audience time to get involved. I would love to hear Daniel's take on, educating consumers from a destination perspective. If you could just give us that briefly while I just look at and pull up a few questions that we have and tee up the Q&A.
Sure. Well, I'd really like to build on both Ewald just finished discussing it, both in terms of food systems, but in emissions. As a scientist, what I've always said to UNWTO and WTTC and other big organizations, we have to have that systems perspective. That in Ewald's case, he demonstrated that it can be done. You can have this holiday versus the road trip to Disneyland with the same amount of carbon. That's huge in terms of educating the consumers, and Erin can speak more to this. And in some parts of Europe, they have sort of carbon labeling for your holidays so that you understand what a green versus an orange. And if you want a beach destination, you can go to Ewald instead of Thailand or whatever the alternative is, and you can compare your carbon. That's important information for decision making that we still unfortunately lack in many ways. But I completely agree in both cases. If you make the consumer an ally, it makes all of that effort far more likely to succeed. Unfortunately, I still see, at least at higher levels of the industry, they don't share the leadership that I see in Ewald, and I wish there was more of that in higher levels of our industry, because I think it's still lacking. Many have yet to come to terms with, the world hopes to be in a net zero economy in 30 years, and I can count probably on one hand the number of what I would say robust climate action plans or strategies at a destination level. Queensland in Australia has a great one, Whistler, maybe Aspen in that group, but there's far more needs to be done, and take some of the leadership that Ewald's already showing at a business level and scale that up.
Excellent, thank you. And now I do have a question in terms of, we were talking about this with the quality and the, it was the quality over quantity discussion, and we mentioned a little bit about pricing, and someone, asked a little bit about cruise. They said, will an increase in yields and higher quality resorts lead to an increase in cruise travel simply because of pricing issues? Does anybody have a take on that in terms of whether or not cruise will become more attractive if we find that the quality, if we find that the pricing of the resorts are increasing? That kind of speaks a little bit to the economic considerations of tourism that we were touching on briefly.
If I may?
Yes.
I would venture to say that the cruise industry is in worse shape than the resort industry, in the sense that they're going to have to even take less customers on board if they want to be able to accommodate them safely. The fact that that they are pushing a whole city around with them at half capacity, and maintain that city operational, because a cruise ship is basically a city. You're talking about 7,000, 8,000 people or 10,000 people in some cases. Now will be reduced to probably about the half. The same as the airlines. They're probably going to fly at 60, 70%, because otherwise you cram too many people together. So that will increase their cost as well. the consumer will also look at the damage that these cruise ships create all over the world. The mass tourism, for instance, in Aruba, they arrive 3 or 4 of these ships in one day. You can't go to town anymore. They rent these ATVs and UTVs and they destroy the countryside. That, I think, is history. I think the cruise ships will have to even more so adjust to the realities of today by reducing quantities, by reducing the amount of emissions that they're creating, and so forth and so forth. So I don't think there is much of a competition from the cruise industry for the rest of the tourism industry.
Daniel or Erin, do you have anything to add to that?
What I've seen on the consumer side is that people who cruised are ready to go back to cruising and largely, and it'll be interesting though, because it's going to be challenging for them to get new customers for sure. Mm-hmm. But I have heard that they, what they're doing to make their ship safe from passing the virus, they've done all these new things. So then that's coming in that may help with them bringing in new customers. But there's certainly, that industry certainly, as Ewald has alluded, it's really brand challenged.
Yeah.
But like I said, people who cruised, a lot of them are ready to go back. Do you see that? So it's not, I wouldn't say that it's going away, but certainly COVID, whatever they do next, whether that's reduced capacity or we'll just have to see.
So you're not seeing a breakdown of trust from the consumer to the cruise industry right now as it stands. So you feel as though, from what you're seeing, they're ready to go back again.
The people who did it before, like I said, it's certainly from at least amongst Americans, it's still cruise overall amongst all American travelers seen as one of the unsafest travel activities. Mm-hmm. But when I look at people who, if I just segment out people who cruised before, they don't look at it as unsafe the way others do.
What's the best way to educate them in this era of climate change, do you think, from that standpoint? What can we do just to pivot their mindset, to just be a little bit more aware of some of the effects of cruising?
I brought up the consciousness and I hate to say shame. It's not the most healthy human emotion. But I know maybe the cruise industry needs to take leadership there, because I think what Ewald's saying is, maybe someone didn't choose Ewald's results solely for the eco and the environmental, but once they got there, they felt pretty damn good, right? And maybe the cruise industry needs to do that. Be far more green, and so that when people make that decision, they feel good. Like, oh, okay, I wasn't having this horrible impact on the environment. And that feels really great to me.
I agree. Daniel, please weigh in.
Sorry, Erin, it's Daniel here. In your data, do you see a real generational divide in terms of existing market share and those repeat customers who, to your point, Denaye, either have ignored the environmental record or are fine with some of the questions that we would raise in terms of sustainability? But do you see in the next generation that those same questions will be asked, and therefore they'll struggle from a new market share?
Yes, a year ago, I was out on the speaking circuit saying, hey, you got to start thinking about climate change, because look at these Gen Z travelers, look at these millennial travelers. It's particularly Gen Z, it's really a part for them. It's a lot more in their consciousness. We already saw that a year ago. And so at some point, there'll be enough pressure, I think, like you said, generationally, enough of those people are going to be traveling that it'll impact on the business level that change.
Guys, we have an interesting question, more so to do with employment and the tourism industry. And I would love to get your take on this. I know Ewald will have some points. I know all of you will have points. I know Daniel will as well from a destination standpoint, but the most vulnerable casualties of the pandemic are the millions of unemployed frontline tourism workers and entrepreneurs in the developing world. Where do they fit into the sustainable tourism recovery that we're speaking about now? Obviously, educating consumers, making sure that as destinations and tourism comes back, they come back better and more sustainable. You know, and how do we keep them from regressing back into poverty? So the question is, you know, out of those vulnerable casualties of the pandemic, where do they, who are in the tourism world and tourism workers and entrepreneurs, where do they fit into the sustainable tourism recovery?
I'll give you my 2 cents on that first, if the others don't mind. That's an amazing question and a really important question. We see that, and you all can speak to that, in the here and now before COVID, you know, when a hurricane would either disrupt or real destruction in a certain island, certain Caribbean islands, but too few of them have the social supports that other countries might have or think that are there for unemployment purposes. And so what we see in the media coverage is, you know, damage to resorts when things start to come back open. But we lose track of those real human stories of the tourism people who are working behind the scenes to provide that experience that Ewald speaks about. So I'd really like to see the industry look more at how do we come up with an employment scheme, whether it's $1 per night that we as travelers put into the system so that social safety net is there and can build a fund. And so we're doing right by our people, but we as the travelers can pay into that as well. If it's not available through the government already, what are some solutions we can, because that's going to be key on climate change is going to bring more of those disruptions. But I think you're also going to see real pressure on the automation side. And I know, you know, the computer check-in that we're using for COVID for contactless purposes isn't a replacement for the person that we want to talk to, but in some cases, automation pressure is going to be there too. And so looking after and doing right by our people, I think, is going to be a fundamental thing that we have to focus on over the next 20 years.
Agree. Ewald, if you could give us some sense from, you know, your own perspective and your own experience since COVID hit. You know, I know there was some economic concerns and pressures, and those hit most hard our tourism workers who have had to be laid off or downsized or shift staff. How are you managing your staff, and how is your staff responding to this? What protocols have you put in place and safeguards to allow them to manage this process?
Okay. Well, after March 10th, the island of Aruba shut down, but we never closed. I called my staff together. I have at that time about over 100 people, and we sat down. We said, "Look, this is going to be." And at that time, it felt like it's going to be 6 months to a year of belt tightening. And I talked to my people and I said, "Look, you know, we can keep the team together if we all reduce our salaries and we all reduce costs as much as we can. I have enough funds to last until the end of the year." And everybody signed up, everybody went along. And so we never reduced staff. The next thing we did is we invited the first responders at the hospital, the doctors and the nurses, to teach us on how to prevent from being infected. In other words, to establish the proper protocols to make sure that our associates and our customers in the future will not have a problem. And so we spend a lot of money in buying equipment, in training, and in inviting these people to perfect our system. So the other thing we have done, of course, also is look at what we're doing, what we're serving. We buy more locally. We don't. In other words, we also try to preserve as much foreign exchange, because we, as an island, we have to buy. We buy everything in the United States. We need dollars. So what we can buy locally is in local currency. So we cater to the local community. We invite the local community to come and enjoy a weekend at our resort. We promote our restaurant, our vegan and vegetarian, and our health and wellness, and it kept us going. We're doing at this moment rather well. We do about 40 to 50% occupancy, which is much better than the average hotel on the island. But it has taken a tremendous effort in getting the team together, in training them properly. And so we have a total protocol that is actually, from the moment the customer checks in, he checks in online. It's all no touch, no keys. It's all electronic. Our concierges receive them at the curb and actually physically on a tablet check them into their room. There's sanitation everywhere. There is the rooms are prepped and sealed after they are totally ionized and UV irradiated, and our staff wears masks. Our customers are not required to wear masks because we are mostly outdoors, and we separated the tables. That actually every table there's a room like 2-3 meters, right? And so social distance throughout the hotel, and so it's pretty safe, and it has worked for us, and our customers trust us. And we kept in touch with our customers and informed them through social media. We informed them through newsletters, mass mailings, and so forth and so forth. So they trust us.
Ewald, I want to interject, because getting back on the whole, making sure that, not just the customers are understanding what it is, but also your support and your staff and not having to lose them. You also ran a program about economic literacy as well with your staff, to encourage them so that they understood exactly what it meant to, to change their own habits so that they can survive throughout this pandemic and not fall into a situation where they're living paycheck to paycheck. Because, in a lot of the tourism industries and a lot of, those entrepreneurs, they rely on that day-to-day business, and having to balance books and understand how that economic pressure can weigh on someone. That's also a testament to sustainability when we look at, the 3 prongs of economic, environment, and people, and social. So I think, that's also a key role that businesses and destinations can also put in place to help safeguard against, this potential economic hardship, that a lot of tourism destinations and workers are facing, is doing what you did and mirroring that economic literacy program, not only from a worker standpoint, but from a destination standpoint, and seeing how we can kind of turn a lot of this negative into positive, more beneficial habits of personnel, so that they can survive this and come out on top. I do want to run to another question that we have, because I am conscious of the time, because we have such a whole lot. And I think this is probably more so for Erin, in terms of the Gen Z. Isn't there a disconnect between the aspirations of those Gen Z who like to travel, have a professional interest in the environment, and are willing to fly, and avail of the low-cost carrier phenomenon? What do we ask them to become, lobbyists or push for more social fuel? This question is a little bit interesting, but they're trying to figure out if there's a disconnect between the aspirations of the Gen Zs who like to travel. Do we kind of use them as some form of an active catalyst to push for more sustainability? Because you were saying that they like to travel in terms of travel segments.
Yes, I think that's a great idea to use them. That generation in particular, I I've seen it in how they respond to COVID regulations like face coverings and all that. And then I saw a professor at Harvard speak, and his observation about Gen Z was same as mine, in that they really want to do the right thing. And so I think if they were educated on the impact of their travel, I'm sure that it would be easy to use them to get behaviors modified. And in large part, just culturally, we kind of look at young people to lead trends and things. So, a lot of times they make destinations popular. So it would have that also would be a benefit of sort of using them as the guinea pig.
I see. So kind of like an influencer type of situation.
Yeah, but I will say one thing though I want to share that does give me a little bit of pause. One thing I have heard from younger travelers though about COVID, and this goes the opposite way of what I'm saying about that actually these two things will go together and make our tourism's impact on the climate better. I have heard this, I didn't realize the world could shut down like this, so once it reopens, I'm going to go see as much as I can before the next pandemic hits, which is kind of more excessive type of mindset. So I just want to bring that up because we may see that happen.
I think that's an important point to consider, because a lot of people are looking at this like, okay, yeah, once the gates open, I'm running for it. And we do want to encourage them. And that gets back to a lot of people's questions. And how do we educate the consumer? How do we ensure that from a government perspective, the right tools are in place to engage them? And then also from the business perspective, that they're experiencing those ideas of what it means to be in a carbon neutral hotel and to experience, say, a more environmentally friendly stay or ride, or go into a more responsible business in the environment. Which leads me to this next question. How can we convince DMOs that sustainable management is just as important as marketing, if not more, especially in destinations that have historically not become concerned with attracting high quality visitors who are more attuned to environmental concerns? Daniel, you may have some insight on this, and Erin as well, perhaps. But the question is, again, how do we convince them that sustainable management is just as important as marketing? And if you're not looking to attract that high quality visitor, then how do you balance this? Sorry, the question.
Yeah, I'm sure Erin will have a lot more to say about it than the idea. I see that disconnect a lot, and part of it is, and Suzanne Becken and I did a study on sort of climate and tourism policy, and there is this complete disconnect, and I would argue it extends into other parts of sustainability as well. We've got tourism policy over here and a lot of people working on that, and then we have the sustainability and climate and other things in another bucket, and they're two different groups of people. Typically they're not connected, and we saw that disconnect from the country level to the state level. And so part of that is getting those groups of people together. And as Ewald so eloquently put it, this is in your best interest, not just now, but in 10 years, 20 years from, it's going to even mean more for you as a destination. I think that's a big part of, and whether you call that leadership, but it's that connection of the industry to other parts of the economy, other parts of policy that remain, unfortunately, in isolation.
But Erin, did you have anything to weigh in on that, or Ewald on that particular question?
I do. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I preach one sentence. We are not in the tourism business. We are in the nature business. Without nature, there is no tourism. And I tell this to my grandkids, and I tell this to my staff, and I tell this to every customer that we have. Nature is our business, and we need to protect it, because especially in the case of Aruba, what are 100,000 people going to do when that one source of business, which is tourism, is destroyed because nature was destroyed? there's nothing else. There's no industry, there's no agriculture, there's no production of anything. So it is important that that we understand that we're not in the tourism business, we're in the nature business. We need to preserve it with everything we have.
Erin, did you have anything to weigh in? If not, I can move to the next question.
Well, I was just going to say exactly what Ewald said. Where we see the leadership on the DMO side are places that are nature-based in their assets. I think that that DMOs representing other types of destinations where it's not so obvious other than trash and things, I mean, it's really the nature-based DMOs that are leading this. And then again, hopefully the urban ones will catch up.
Daniel, I want to get your perspective on policy, if I can, from a destination level. You might have mentioned this slightly or briefly, but what are some pertinent issues that government must create policy around right now as we're looking at COVID, climate change, sustainability, to kind of encourage that build back tourism better right now? Are you seeing any changes from a policy level at the destination level? Are we seeing it more from the public side? Are there private businesses jumping on board from a destination level to help see this? What are some of those I guess policies that we need to see to realize change at the destination level from a COVID standpoint, a climate change standpoint, and a sustainability standpoint, because they all kind of interlink at one section or another?
Yeah, I'm always thrilled when I hear people like Ewald in his, nature is the business they're in, that is the perspective far more businesses need. That needs to translate up to the destination and country leadership level. And I see elements of whether you call it hope or progress. As I mentioned, I may have mentioned that in Jamaica's new or ongoing tourism strategy. 2 of the 5 objectives have specific climate change elements in it. That was unheard of, 5 years ago, and it will set a new bar for as that strategy is developed. And it has, the language in it is to connect those tourism policies throughout to other parts of the economy, so that you all mentioned how they work with local agriculture, so that closing some of the system components, keeping it and less leakage out of the economy because of that. Those elements are starting to come, but I think we need to see a lot more of it. From the country level right down to the destination level, and having company level leadership showing this is in our best interest. This is a business decision as much as it is sustainability or environment, as some will see it. It's not just CSR related things, it's the future of our business.
I agree. Thank you, Daniel, for weighing in. Does anybody else have anything to weigh in on that question before I move to the next? Okay, excellent. We have a lot of questions. And guys, if we are unable to get to your questions throughout this chat, throughout this discussion, please know that we will have resources available for you to connect with myself and our panelists and our speakers to continue that conversation. We would love for you to continue that conversation. You can get in touch with CREST to get a lot more of your questions answered. This is something on, there's a question here on the type of travel that we're looking at. You discussed that leisure might become more exclusive, but what happens with the rest? And what happens to the providers that serve more massive tourists?
Can I try?
Yes, please, Ewald.
I would say that the large tour operators, and when I'm talking about the large tour operators like Thomas Cook and TUI and Thomson and so forth, and some of the larger U.S. tour operators will have to consolidate. They will have to shrink. They will not be sending the 19, 23 million visitors out per year that they used to. The whole business, I think, will shrink down to considerably. And I think it was Erin, I think it was Erin that mentioned that a lot of the traffic already goes locally. It does not go as much internationally anymore. But the major thrust of these tour operators was long haul travel. And that I think will adjust in the coming years. It's not gonna be the same in the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay. Erin, here's another question possibly for you, or actually for any of the panelists, but it is a little bit more consumer driven in terms of how it's worded. Do we see a shift in the idea that travelers contribute more to the destination that they visit? Are they more willing to contribute to communities and reserves and on-the-ground projects? I'm not sure if you answered and asked any of those pointed questions to a lot of your constituents, but do you see that travelers are more willing to contribute to communities, reserves, and on-the-ground projects when they're traveling more, or so say impact travel, based travel? Are we seeing an uptick in any of this?
You know, I did ask that, I think a year ago. Sorry, I don't have the stats in my head. It's never as much as we hope, right? I've been asking these types of questions for so many weeks. It's never the highest percentages as we want, and I don't have a benchmark. But it's certainly, I'm glad you asked. I'll ask it again in a future survey and see. I mean, imagine that that's going to grow. It's given the situation that we're in.
Yeah, and with impact tourism, I think the great thing about it is being able to link when you do going to a destination with a purpose, right? We always talk about purpose, people, planet, purpose, and aligning those, and being able to go into a destination to help or to even do both, experience it, enjoy it. You see it from a different point of view when you're from the community perspective, and I think you kind of get to go behind that beaten path. And it alludes to the whole equitable distribution of wealth when we talk about tracking that tourism dollar and where it goes. So impact travel isn't just to come and help build something or to help fix something, but it's also to learn and to get that immersive travel experience involved, and that immersive travel experience from that traveler, from that consumer, and where your tourism dollar is going. You can see it actually having that change and making that difference. And you can see what the country itself cares about and how they're going to move forward. And you actually contribute to that. So that also gives that consumer that feel good kind of feeling, and that want to come back and explore from a completely different perspective as well. But also I think we can use this as a tool and as a catalyst to kind of open the eyes and educate about how climate change is affecting a lot of these coastal areas and these SIDS and these islands and these big ocean states, and what travelers can actually do to educate themselves, and actually tangible solutions that they can do to help solve this crisis, how they can be more mindful because they would have been in it and they would have immersed themselves in a completely different way of life that they wouldn't have had they just come to the destination just to say, look at, the commercial part of it. So I'm an advocate for impact travel personally and nature-based travel. And I think that it has a dual purpose, not only of how it has multiple purposes, not only just in educating the consumer, but also in allowing the community to thrive and getting a different perspective and giving us that experience that you won't be able to find had you traveled or gone to that destination. You see it through completely different eyes than you would if you were just going for, say, business. I do have a question though for you, Erin, as well. You mentioned that business travelers are probably traveling a little bit less or not extending their stays as much, and that leisure is actually somewhat up as well. For those destinations, for Bermuda, for instance, where we'd like to convert that business traveler into that leisure travel segment, are we going to see that decrease more? Are we going to see people just kind of hop in and hop out? Or is that trend of leisure, or as I like to call it, workation, going to go away from a consumer standpoint?
That's a good question. I think if someone makes a decision that a business trip to Bermuda is something that they're willing to invest the corporate money and time in, I think there's still a great opportunity. There's probably even more opportunity for leisure, right? We just tested workations this last week, and there's certainly a significant degree of interest there. It's just the volume of trips. I mean, we all know tourism can't recover to 2019 levels without corporate and group meeting travel, and those two segments are just not back yet. And again, we're seeing more of this consciousness, like, well, I'm just not going to go on all these gazillion business trips I used to go on. I'm going to be very, very choosy about what I decide to do. So I think if you can get someone there, there's opportunity to convert them to leisure. And then of course, there's opportunity to get them to come back simply for leisure. But the volume, it's going to take some time to recover.
I agree. So we're down to about the last 5 minutes. I just wanted to ask if we want to keep going, or Greg, did you have some wrap-ups that you wanted to get involved, that you wanted to just shout out, or can we just keep rolling with the questions?
Rock and roll. I think we've got a great set of momentum here, and I'm following very closely both the Q&A and the chat, and we're scratching the surface at best.
Yeah,
there's a tremendous amount of interest, and
we never have enough time.
So please, Denaye, go right to the end.
Yeah, excellent. We never have enough time, and this is probably more of a question for Daniel to get you back to the swing of things. In terms of, there was a question from someone dealing with the Caribbean islands, developing on environmentally sensitive areas for mass tourism. How can we kind of, from a destination standpoint, for those who are looking to develop, mass tourism, for those who are looking to increase tourism within, their islands and not roll into mass tourism, what are some of the tangible solutions that they can look into? What can governments do in terms of looking at how they can safeguard these sensitive areas from becoming mass tourism areas? Because the Caribbean's looking to develop, every place is looking to develop, but how do we do it smart? How do we do it sustainably? And what are some suggestions you have for those destinations?
Mm-hmm. In many cases, there are plans in place that, if kept to, you would avoid some of those implications or impacts that you've just listed. And now COVID gives you that opportunity for a little bit of a pause. I think I looked it up from a real estate perspective. There was 52 new resorts being built within the Caribbean region as they defined it when COVID struck. Are those in the right places? Are they going to continue? What's going to happen to capacity going forward? And as Ewald mentioned, we've just finished a new study on what sea level rise means to the Caribbean, 4,800 resorts we've looked at. Some of those resorts are coming up for refreshing. Some are coming up to their useful lifespan. That's the opportunity to take some of those out, perhaps restore some of the nature, whether it's mangroves or other areas in those places. So there's opportunities to right size some of that construction as well. That's where development banks, as well as the government, have a real role, because if you're going to decommission, a derelict resort, or one that just doesn't have a future, what benefit can you bring back when you take that facility out? So I think there's a lot of things that can be done. Many of them are actually outlined in some of the tourism strategic plans within the countries, but they're not always followed.
That's the key, right? It's following them. I think someone put in the chat or in one of the questions about the EIA process, and maybe we need more resources on the enforcement side of things, and in the planning department, and in, let's just be honest, in the economics departments, because, we need people who have the power and who have the money to build and do what they like will often move forward. And it's for us, we need to hold our own accountable for the type of developments that we do put in place. So I think looking on the flip side at the enforcement of a lot of these policies that we're going to put in place and that we're encouraging governments to put in place needs to be looked at now as we move forward as well. I mean, the same as, you're going to do a COVID-19 inspection and a health inspection before you're going to allow a business to reopen. The same should be done from a destination standpoint. If you're going to have a development come in or have a new tourism asset be built, we need to put in place the policies that were written to protect and safeguard it, but also we need to police it, and we need to have the funding available for that audit process to happen from a third party standpoint, before these kind of move forward, and make sure that it's safeguarded against corruption and against economic gains in that area. And I mean, that's just the truth. Let's just speak, frankly about it. We're coming up against a lot of issues that need a lot of funding to solve. And we need to have good investors and smart investors, and we need to have educated governments and educated policymakers to not only create these laws, but to enforce them as well. I have a question here from someone who's asking about how can we apply effective carrying capacity to programs and places that are suffering from over-tourism? How can we define the limits? What is the limit of, what is mass tourism, and what is that carrying capacity limit? How do we create a limit on over-tourism? Does anyone have any insights into over-tourism and how we can cap that? Not really.
Well, I'm happy to give you my 2 cents worth. So I think first and foremost, that has to be an inclusive process, because what is over-tourism to one, even an operator versus somebody else? What is over-tourism to the community versus the tourism industry versus government that is located in making decisions, but from a national capital can be 3 very different things. So it's an inclusive process, but it's, the community's interest should be first and foremost, because they live with it. But that makes it very difficult to come up with a nice round number. And as the Barcelona example I gave you, the community came up with a number, but the local decision makers kept the gates open to allow more aircraft to come in and superseded that. So people have to engage in a process that's inclusive, and come up with a common vision of how do we get to a place where we can all be happy with what we have coming in. And there's no one way to do that.
Yeah, no, I love that sentiment of inclusivity, because it speaks to a lot of what we're talking about here in the broader sense, in that we need to be inclusive when we come up with these strategies and these solutions to how we're going to tackle COVID, how we're going to tackle climate change in this era, and traveling in this era of both. And I would love to get everyone's just final thoughts to wrap up in terms of traveling in the era of COVID and climate change, and being more inclusive of those 2 things. What are your, I guess, leaving or your magic potions as to how we can coexist, and how travel and tourism can still thrive by keeping both of those in mind in an inclusive way? I'll start off with you, Erin. From a consumer standpoint, what are some things or best practices or some things that you think travelers can bear in mind when they're looking at COVID and climate?
I'm just going to have to go back to that more just being more aware and conscious, and that sticks, and that they personally have an impact. We can't be in this excess mindset anymore.
I like that. We cannot afford to be in that access mindset anymore. That's a good point. Ewald, if you could weigh in and give us your final thoughts on COVID and climate and traveling and tourism, and what that means for the future of your business. You're still on mute.
I would say that we need to educate our consumers, our customers, our staff, and just keep on predicating that we need to preserve nature, that we need to ameliorate global warming, and so that we can continue to subsist, because the tourism industry employs 10% of the workforce worldwide, I think, is the last statistic. And so if tourism, and mostly tourism is not just business travel, but it's a lot of leisure travel. If that industry is not delivering or cannot deliver, I think we're all in trouble.
Daniel, your final thoughts, and then I'll weigh in with final thoughts and some closing remarks.
Sure. Well, so as a geographer and as a tourism scholar, I want my 2 teenage daughters to be able to see the world in the same way I have. There are so many benefits that come from that. Being able to live with other cultures around the world. I absolutely want them to be part of that. tourism or travel industry is not going to solve climate change or COVID on its own, but travelers vote and they can advocate. And so my strongest message is vote to begin with, because that's where the power to change the system lies there. And the more people that put pressure on their government leaders, from anything like massive investment in R&D to electrify regional aircraft or hydrogen aircraft, getting a low emission, longer haul option for aircraft is in the tourism industry's best interest. It's in SID's best interest. It's in the aviation, it is key to solving this puzzle. And for 10, 20 years, we've advocated for that investment on behalf of airlines, countries, and it hasn't really happened. There was a biofuels effort for some time, but that's not going to do it. So I would say vote, and as you vote, put pressure on the types of investment you want to see that are key to the future of travel.
I agree. Thank you so much, all three of my amazing panelists. To close up from me, Managing Director at JustaTAAD, I love to have these types of discussions and conversations. It's what I do, and it's a ethos of education is something that I hold near and dear. So educating travelers, educating businesses, and working with businesses to secure sustainability and understand how they can underpin their COVID-19 practices with sustainability is something that I do, and I love to do it. And I'm happy that we have seen so much amazing discussion around this topic, and we will continue to see it. If you'd like to continue this discussion and conversation, I'm happy to work with you guys to facilitate it. But my 2 cents is definitely education, education. Continue having this discussion and inviting not only like-minded businesses, but those who you would not think are, even resonating with this topic, because it helps to shed light on how we can find and partner with different communities and different industries to really solve this concern, to solve this issue, and bring light to a lot of these topics that we spoke about today, from equitable distribution to climate change, to being carbon neutral, to educating consumers, to getting destinations to understand, to policy making, and vote. Please do vote. It's very key. It's very important. It's always, those who are in power that will decide what we do, but our voice matters, and we can only have our voice matter by voting. So I will hand it over to Greg to close us out. Thank you all again, participants. You can connect with all of us either by through chat right here, or by chatting with CREST to get our specific information to connect with us specifically. Thank you guys again. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation that I'm sure will lead to more discussions.
Yes, this was an extraordinary exchange. And Denaye, I want to, from all of us, thank you very much for leading a very robust and I think very stimulating discussion. When we put this webinar together, we had talked as panelists and as colleagues about whether we wanted to make presentations as you know, I really wanted us to have this kind of discussion. And it exceeded my expectations and those of my colleagues, certainly at CREST. We will follow up with the participants, attendees, in terms of other additional resources, as has been noted a few times on the chat. I want to thank Erin, Ewald, Danielle, and Denaye for just an extraordinary panel. One of the things since I'll have the last word, thanks again. And I just want to underscore how important it is to recognize that the future is not to be carried on the backs of individuals. There has to be systemic change at all levels in order to see the kind of transition to a more sustainable future. And Daniel, I really appreciate you recognizing how important it is the individual can choose and be defined by choices as a result of voting. And obviously in the United States, that is of key importance. While CREST is not a political organization, we are an advocacy-based organization, and it is essential that people vote and vote for a sustainable future and leaders that focus on. So it's the leadership, both in the government, the corporate side, that's going to make the difference for us. And as individuals, we can influence that. So thank you, everyone. I wish you all good health. I was very pleased to see how the high level of participation stayed to the very end. That was very exciting to see, and we, on behalf of the CREST board and staff and all of our partners, thank you very much again to our panelists and to Denaye as moderator. This was an exceptional experience for all of us today. Thanks and good day. So we'll be closing the webinar now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.